Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Wisconsin Women in Conservation Summer Camp webinar on bugs and beetles. We're so glad today. My name is Stephanie Kaufman, and I work for Marbleseed, and I am the Northwest Regional Coordinator for WeWick. So this is a lunch webinar, so please feel free to munch on your lunch. And we have two phenomenal rockstar speakers who are going to be sharing lots of great information on bugs and beetles today. Before we start our presentation, we're going to do a quick introduction of WeWick and our upcoming events. Then we will hear from our two lovely content experts, and after that, we'll have some time for questions. But all right, let's go ahead and get started on our overview of WeWick. Esther is a research agronomist at Michael Fields and also the program director for this project WeWick. So Esther, if you could please take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everyone. Very happy and excited to welcome you all for another WeWick webinar from the summer series of 2023. I'm very happy and excited for today's event, Critters of Conservation, Bugs and Beetles. So the title of, as you all are aware, the title of today's presentation is Critters of Conservation, Bugs and Beetles. Special thanks to the presenters of today, Thelma Heil-Baker and Sherry Nolden. Thelma has supported WeWick right from the beginning as a resource person, and I've had the pleasure of interacting and listening to Sherry on Dung Beetles. So I'm looking forward to a great webinar here today. Before we get into the presentation, I'd like to introduce WeWick to those of you who are here for the first time. Wisconsin Women in Conservation is a project that's led by the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute in partnership with 4 other organizations, Renewing the Countryside, Marbleseed, Wisconsin Farmers Union, and with our research effort being led by E-Resources Group. This project is funded by the Natural Resources Conservation Service and RCS. As you're all aware, WeWick works with women landowners who farm, non-operators, beginning farmers, and also conservation educators. We provide a safe space to share stories and connect to one another. We also provide the opportunity to meet other women who are passionate about conservation just as you are. Find a network of peers and professionals to thrive with. And during these events, events are there to learn together about building a healthy soil. And you also, WeWick also provides the support and the technical help for conservation plans. We collaboratively help steward a land for future generations and build a local community to support and grow. So WeWick 1, we started out in October of 2020, and the first part of the project comes to an end in 3 months' time. We worked in 6 tri-county clusters in Wisconsin, and we still do. And so far, we have about 2,594 women who are actively engaged in all our events, newsletters. 56 conservation plans have been completed and given to the women, and many more are in the process of being written. We conducted 35 Zoom events, 34 learning circles, 16 field days, 13 educator events. And the first ever Wisconsin Conservation Educators Conference was down in April of 2023, which is much appreciated and a sold out event. Our events are research driven, and it is led by E-Resources Group, as I mentioned. So based on our research data that comes in, we kind of pivot our events as per the need and the feedback that we receive from the participants. Most of you know the boots on the ground staff are coordinators who work with each of you to make your dreams for your land a reality. They put a lot of time and effort in organizing and bringing various resources to you at each of these learning circles, field days, and they also continue to work with you if you express your interest in a conservation plan. So the events in 2023, we are done with the spring learning circles. We had our educator happy hours last week, and we almost had about 100 educators connect with the project in different parts of the state. We are done with the 4 field days. There are 2 field days that's coming up in August through WeWick. One is in Forage County, and the other one is in Grazing. If you want to attend one of these events, please go onto our website and register for one of these events. Our summer webinars, this is the 3rd, and we have one more to come in August. and our fall learning circles will be are happening in the fall. We also are bringing out a beautiful lookbook of all the beautiful conservation efforts and work that is done by the women farmers of Wisconsin. And that will come out in October. So we are all inviting each one of you to be a participant in that lookbook launch party. And it'll happen in 4 different places of Wisconsin in the month of October. We bring professional and program resources to your land. And we also have conservation coaches, and we bring technical help in order to write those conservation plans. So at the end of it all, coordinators work with you to help you get a conservation plan to see, like, visually see what you want on your land happen. WIWIC also supports a listserv, and if you want to exchange ideas and questions, please sign up for to be on our WIWIC listserv. That's about it, but I take this opportunity to invite each and every one of you to participate in one of our WIWIC events. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Okay, now we're going to introduce our content expert, Thelma Heidelbaker. A little bit about Thelma before I pass the baton off to her. Thelma is an entomologist, conservation specialist, and organic grazing farmer. She has extensive science and research experience in sustainable agriculture and conservation practices. Thelma holds graduate degrees in entomology and has on-the-ground experience supporting beneficial insects and establishing wildlife habitats. She currently works as a farm conservation planner for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Thelma also brings grazing and wildlife conservation together on Bossy Cow Farm, her family's grass-based dairy farm near Random Lake, Wisconsin. All right, Thelma, we're excited to hear from you. So take it away when you're ready.
All right. Well, I'm really excited to be here today. I love these WIWIC events and being a part of it, whether I am a participant and just listening or being able to talk about the things that I know, love, and like sharing with others. It doesn't really matter what context it is. These are always really great. So today I wanted to talk about one of the things that I have basically spent my life pursuing, which is just learning about insects and what that means. The depth, the knowledge, the importance of knowing about them, and why well, I probably won't get so much into why they're underappreciated, but know that they often are. And when we talk about it in conservation, I feel like the insects need a little bit more voice that we are providing, because they are often just kind of forgotten about because they're not right in front of our faces. And a lot of us are there's a lot of people that are kind of afraid of them. There's a lot of mentalities behind insects that sometimes need to be changed, that they're not all negative, they're not all pests, they're not all bad, and there's a lot of beneficial things in our world when that happen without insects. So yeah, critters of conservation, and I know we said bugs and beetles, and I'm going to really emphasize and more, because insects are so diverse. And I'm going to bring a lot of just my diverse background into this conversation today, because while I have been a research scientist in the past and done a lot of work on integrated pest management and beneficial insects in agricultural cropping systems, I today do a lot more planning with other farms and thinking about what their conservation goals are, and then what that means in terms of thinking about the insects. And it's not always the first thing that people are focused on. It's a lot of soil health, or if they have animals, livestock, and feed and things like that. But in the backside of, like, what else can you do to also support these critters of conservation? Okay, so I wear a lot of different hats, and it's always important, I think, to bring into this, because like I said, it's where I draw on my experiences. I'm an entomologist. I work for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service right now in Washington and Ozaukee counties, and in Wisconsin. So I work with a lot of local farmers there on a lot of different things, not just insect conservation, but grazing, soil health, cover crops, vegetable production. So all of those things are pieces that I bring into what I do. And then I also run a farm with my husband, a Bossy Cow Farm, where we do organic grass-fed dairy and chickens and other poultry. And it's a vital piece to be able to take what I know and put it into practice, and then go and also make recommendations to other people as to what they should do. I feel it adds a lot of validity to what I say. And then I'm a mom. I have a lot of I've got kids at home. I'm thinking about it too. The education piece is really important to me to pass on that knowledge to my children and make sure that they appreciate all that is around them. And I hope that they do. Sometimes they may not like insects as much as I want them to, but that's okay. All right, so we're going to get this conversation going here right now. And I kind of talked about how insects may not be at the forefront of all of your minds, but maybe they should be. So I like to start out here because birds come up a lot when we talk about diversity in the world. A lot of people know about the birds. You probably watch birds if you have bird feeders outside. You're pretty familiar with a lot of them that we have here in Wisconsin. And I was curious to see how many different breeding species of birds we had in Wisconsin. And we have 243 breeding species, which is a lot. And I was like, it's quite a few species, but at the same time, we know a lot about each of those species. You can go and pick up like the Audubon Bird Guide, and you can know information on each one of those species. And when we go to the insect side, it is a lot less known. And so what I wanted to show here is just simply that these insects that we have in Wisconsin are hugely diverse, and there's so much that is unknown about them. We know that bees in particular, there's about 400 species of bees in Wisconsin. But if you try to name off a couple of them, you might know a couple bumblebees. Honeybee doesn't really even count because it's not a native species. Maybe you might know some of the solitary native bees, but even myself, I'm like, okay, maybe I can do like 10 on my hands. And we have 400 species. That means there are hundreds of species that we hardly know anything about. Then we go to beetles, which is one of the most diverse insect groups like in the world, beetles. And I looked at beetle identification.org, and they said there's 189 species in Wisconsin. That is a very conservative number. I'm sure there are way more than that, but we don't have anybody that's really looking into that. Or, I mean, there are professors and people doing it in Madison, but there's so many more species to find. Butterflies is around 124 species. Deer, horseflies. There are over 30 species of just deer and horseflies in Wisconsin. And mosquitoes, 56 species. It's probably even more than that. But I don't even have on here ants, moths, all the different flies. So they're hugely diverse. Aphids. Every plant species is assumed to have at least one aphid species on them. So you think about all the plants that we have, there's going to be an aphid species attached to it. It's just, insects are so diverse and there's so much that we don't know about them. And it's hard to appreciate something if you don't know it exists. And there's so many insect species that we don't know exist right here in our own state. So just kind of keep that in mind. And just some of the photos that I've taken, just showing these are some of the iconic ones. And what I'm going to talk about today is just some of the summer icon insects and kind of tying them in with not just being the insect side, but also thinking about the habitat, the soil health, soil quality, I mean, all those pieces that come into play with the environment that we live in on a daily basis. And whether you have a small farm, large farm, no farm, you just go to parks, all these pieces come into play. So this is a graphic that was done from a book called Life in the Soil by Jim Nardi. And it's just kind of emphasizing and showcasing all these different life forms that exist at the soil surface or below the soil surface. And we're not going to get into all these. You can read the whole book if you want to, just to learn more about all this life that exists, from things from bacteria to fungi, and then to the insects, which is what we're focused on today, and all these other invertebrates, collembola, springtails, grubs, and all these things that come into play and are just life overall that help build soil health, that help build biodiversity. And are not the things that we see. If you look out your window right now, you're probably going to see green vegetation. We don't usually think about what's going on under the soil as much because it's just not right in front of us. So I'm going to start my little story here. I'm going to highlight a few different insects of summer because summer is right here in front of our face. And most of the time when I do these talks, we are not in the middle of summer and we don't get to see these things firsthand and foremost. Right now, we have the peak of summer blooms going on here in Wisconsin. If you have a prairie near you, I encourage you to get out and see what's going on those flowers. And one of the things that you'll probably see right now is the monarch butterfly. We have been collecting them in our lab or in our office to use for some of these field days that I have next week that I'm doing. So to collect the larvae and the caterpillars and the eggs, and hopefully get some adults. I'm sure you're all familiar with the adult. The monarch butterfly is out and about right now. We are in its summer breeding grounds here in Wisconsin, which is really important because this is where milkweed comes into play. Milkweed is the primary and only food that the caterpillars here, like on the right, can feed on. So if we don't have milkweed, we don't have the monarchs. And being in the breeding grounds here, it's really important that we have that food source for these insects. And this is a picture here of the milkweed egg in particular. And so we tend to focus a lot on the milkweed. We have to have milkweed out there, but we tend to forget sometimes that these butterflies, like on the right here, also need to have a lot of other nectar sources. So this is where diversity comes into play, and why we need to have a lot of different types of blooms and flowers out on the landscape that can support these, not just now, but also early on in the season. So thinking about a month ago, when flowers just started to bloom, I saw my first monarch show up in Wisconsin in mid-May, and there are not a lot of blooms then. And thinking about, like, well, how do they survive that early in the season? So it's something that we have to think about as we are supporting and wanting to do conservation on our own land, of like, where are these flower sources coming from? What are we doing? It's not just the milkweed, it's milkweed as well as other species. And these plants out here also provide wonderful cover over the soil. If you have open spaces on your land that you could do improvement on, or some spaces that don't have a lot of native diversity on, something like a flowering meadow would be really, really beneficial. And in addition to that, it also helps provide a lot of diversity of roots below the ground. Remember, I was talking about why it's important for like soil health and things. All these diverse plant species, particularly prairie plants, go deep into the ground. They help with soil and water filtration, soil building, carbon sequestration, and things like that. And this is just a map. This comes from the Xerces Society, showing the monarch migration. You know, it's easy for us to just look at what's going on here in our corner of the world, because that's what we have right in front of us. But these monarchs, and you help support them, is a whole continental phenomenon in itself. They're moving to Mexico every year. These monarchs migrate generation after generation. They go down to Mexico, and then several generations later, they come back here. So we're just a part of their story. And so we want to help keep that story going for the many generations of monarchs, and for generations of humans, so that our children, grandchildren in the future can also be able to enjoy the story of the monarch. This is a photo that one of my coworkers took yesterday at one of our field plots that we have worked on. They planted this to a monarch meadow 3 years ago, and this is what it looked like yesterday. It's just a phenomenal thing to be able to see and enjoy, and beneficial for insects as well as for us as humans. Something that could happen on your property. And if you want to know more about which nectar plants you can plant that would work best in our area, the Xerces Society has this wonderful publication called The Monarch Nectar Plants of the Great Lakes. We can share the link for that as well if you are interested in it. It's a list of all the plant species, not just the milkweeds, but also the other flowering plants and different times of the year that they bloom, to help support the monarchs as best you can on your land. And they're beautiful. They're beautiful plants for us to behold, as well as for the butterflies to be able to utilize. So I'm going to move on to another summer icon insect. And I think this is one that's really important for anybody who has gardens, who grows crops. I'm sure you recognize it, hopefully anyway. This is the group of beetles called the lady beetles. So lady beetles are ones that are often orange or reddish colored. Oftentimes they have spots, but not always. They're one of them that, you know, symbolizes good luck. I think about all the things that come from, like, as a kid, kids know lady beetles, right? You draw a red circle, you put the black dots in there, and little kids will know what that insect is. So I just want to delve in a little bit deeper as to why these are important and why I want to talk about them today, because I mentioned soil and connections there, and it's not always obvious. These are wonderful predators. They're predatory insects. They will feed on soft-bodied insects. This upper photo here is feeding on an aphid. This bottom one was feeding on a soybean aphid at some point on a soybean plant. But they will travel around a cropping system or your garden and find the insects and feed on them. The adults are the ones we recognize, but what I really want to emphasize is the other stage of these insects, which is the larval form, which is one that I again and again come across people saying, hey, I've been killing these insects. What are these? I get a lot of emails and photos and texts from people that go, they want to know if it's good or bad. And the insect world is not really dichotomous in terms of being bad or good. There's a lot of gray area in there. But I get a lot of these photos and people go, are they bad or good? And they'll tell me they've been killing them. And I'm like, no, these are beneficial. These are the larvae of the lady beetles. They all have this kind of alligator look to it. And I want to make sure that you know what they look like, because if you see them out there, you want them. They're beneficial, but they look so different than the adults by far. And they all have this kind of black alligator look. Some have orange spots on them. Some have orange lines on them, but really critical. And then in terms of supporting and trying to conserve these lady beetles, one of the really important things that they do is wintertime, when they overwinter, they tend to overwinter in protected spots, things like leaf litter or rocks and crevices in the ground. So having that type of habitat to provide for them is really important. Now, some of the non-native ones that you may be familiar with, there's the multicolored Asian lady beetle. That's the one that will get into people's houses. And actually my old windows on my 1850s farmhouses still got some in the corners there. But a lot of the native ones don't do that. They don't come into the house. One of the things that we had on our farm was I raked up a pile of leaves several years ago. And I remember in the spring, I realized that I hadn't done anything with that leaf pile from the fall because life got busy. So I just left it out there. And when I started moving it and breaking it up, I realized it had dozens of the pink spotted native lady beetle in it. So I had left unintentionally that habitat, but that is what they use to overwinter in. So it's kind of one of those things that sometimes those pieces that we forget about on the landscape can be really important for overwintering, conserving, because they do want to live at that soil surface or the interface or rock piles and things like that. Another really important group of insects, which are probably meeting their peak right now, are pollinators. And in particular, I want to talk about bumblebees here today, because bumblebees are just super cool, really interesting. And one of probably the showcase pollinator of the native pollinators that we have here in Wisconsin. I don't want to talk about honeybees. They're not native. They're a whole separate group. But these bumblebees, if you have any flowers out and about right now around your house, or you have a prairie near you, I encourage you to get out there and see right now what is all going on in terms of the bumblebee species. I took this photo on the left this morning about an hour ago. I just went out to I have a pollinator garden in front of my house. I wanted to see what was going on out there, and I found two different species of bumblebees out there within 1 minute. And it's one of those that if you don't look, you don't know what you have. And you can have a lot of diversity of bumblebees without realizing it, because a lot of times you're just looking for a big fuzzy bee and not realizing you actually might have 2 or 3 species. So this one on the left, I believe, is Bombus vagans. It's the half black bumblebee. And then this one on the right is called the 2-spotted bumblebee, and I love this photo, you can actually see the 2 spots on its abdomen here that give it the characteristic spots for its name, or Bombus bimaculatus is the scientific name for them. And they're fairly common bees that we have here. But again, if you don't look, you don't know. On our farm several years ago, I did a survey of bumblebee species. I wanted to see what we had in our pastures, because our pastures aren't necessarily native grasses, but we have a lot of clovers and things in there. And I found 6 bumblebee species within a very short period of time, within a few hours. And we have about 25 species of bumblebee in Wisconsin. So I'd say 6 bees out of the 25 overall species is a pretty good find within just our pasturing systems. But again, these bees need to have those native flowers. They respond really well to blooms. They come out at times of year. Their colonies are really building up now. So they have to have flowers and nectar to be able to survive and reproduce and recreate. So this is why they're visiting the flowers. And this is why I encourage you to get out there and look at the flowers and what's going on out there to support them. Now, this is me yesterday, thinking about how also to support bumblebees. It's not just the flowers, but it's also knowing and understanding where they nest. And maybe if you think about it, maybe you've seen a bumblebee nest somewhere, or at least where they go and hide. I'm sure a few of you have. So this is the threshold going into my garage. And I happened to be looking down and I saw a little hole, and into that little hole went a bumblebee. And I couldn't believe it because I was like, there's nothing underneath there. But then I realized this is a really old shed. It's probably about 100 years old. And there's probably a rock foundation underneath there that somebody put some concrete over the top of it. And they found that there's cavities underneath there. So these bumblebees create their nests in some type of a cavity. So they could be rock cavities. It could be old burrows. I've heard people saying that they'll find nests in like rodent burrows or rabbit burrows and things like in the ground. They've also will go into like clumps of grass. So if you have a big clump of grass, sometimes they'll make a nest inside of there. There's all these unique spaces that they will create a nest in. But bumblebees never go back to the same place again. So if I see a nest here this year, they won't be back there next year. They'll go on to a new place. But understanding where it is that they might nest becomes important. You can't really make bumblebee nest, unfortunately. It'd be nice if we could, but we can't. And this is just kind of showing that whole life cycle of the bumblebees. Unlike honeybees that make these huge nests with hundreds of thousands of bees, bumblebees will maybe have a colony that goes up to maybe 50 individuals in size. And they only exist as a colony over the summertime. Once fall comes, late summer and fall, the colony dissipates and only one bee will overwinter, and that is the queen. And so she will find her own special hiding place, protected spot to go over winter. And then in the springtime, the whole cycle starts again. And if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the Wisconsin bumblebees, there's this really cool citizen science program, Wisconsin Bumblebee Brigade. I would look up that website, and you can get this field guide to females. And I have this printed off and I carry it with me almost everywhere I go, just because if I run into a bee or see one, it's so hard for me to remember which species is which. And so I'll have this printed copy along with me to see. And that's how I looked up to see that it was Bombus vagans. The half black was the one that I found this morning. So free resources. You can also track your bumblebees and report them to this. It's a DNR program, and you can help contribute to Wisconsin bumblebee conservation. The last species or group that I have here is this one. So I'm not sure if you all know what this is. And maybe I should have done a poll to have people guess, but this is the larval form of one that I'm sure you're familiar with. It's out right now. It's one of the really big icons of summer, and that's the firefly. So if we go back, larval form doesn't look anything like the typical firefly or lightning bug or whatever you want to call it that we see flashing on the warm summer evenings. And last night, my kids convinced me to go sleeping in the camper. So I went to bed with them out there, and we were watching the fireflies as we were going to sleep because they are out and about right now, and it is beautiful to behold. Well, a few things about the fireflies, and I really appreciate them, is that they're getting a lot more attention now because they can really be an indicator species of a health of a system. It's not just their blinking, but they exist in very moist, wet environments, typically, especially the larvae, and the larvae are predators. Really good predators are soft-bodied insects. Think about things like slugs and other small insects, worms and things like that. That's what the larvae feed on. And the larvae can exist for years in our environment before they ever become adults. So it becomes really important then to have really healthy, high quality environments that don't have chemicals and pesticides in them, so that these insects can keep reproducing. And if you've heard anything about insect declines, one of them that we've also hear about is how there's a lot of these fireflies that are also in decline. And we're just not seeing them as much because of some of these challenging things that are happening. Now, you think about too, a lot of us have been experiencing really dry conditions in the last month. Some of you are in drought right now. Dry conditions are not conducive to fireflies who need these more wet environments for their larvae to be able to exist. So we need to have those moist areas, otherwise we kind of lose some of these. And I've noticed now in our area, we've gotten some rain, and so now the fireflies are starting to come out. This is just a quick graphic showing what there's 3 different groupings of these fireflies, glowworms, then the day fireflies, and then the typical ones that we see that flash in the evenings. So it's typically the males that are flashing, and then they hope that a female will respond with her own seductive flash that can get the male's attention. That's the ones that we see in the evening. There are also the glowworms, and I've only seen those once or twice, but the glowworms are, the females glow. They basically look like a larvae, but they exist in the soil. They don't fly around, and they will flash. And then we have the daytime ones that don't flash at all, and they find their mates with chemical cues. They don't use the lights at all. So just kind of a cool thing to look at, to understand the fireflies, and the flashing patterns and stuff will determine different species and things like that. I'd love to go more into fireflies, but we don't have the time. Yeah. But if you would like to know more about fireflies, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation came out with this publication several years ago, The State of the Fireflies for the United States and Canada. It's a wonderful resource. If you want to learn more about fireflies and which species we have here in Wisconsin that are threatened, this would be the place to go. It's a free publication that you can get online. We'll share the link to it. I'd highly recommend that you go there.
Thank you so much, Thelma. That was fascinating. So we are going to now move on to Sherry Nolden, our citizen scientist for today's webinar. Just real quick about Sherry. Sherry owns and operates a 130-acre farm in the Driftless area, and she has managed her forage-based farm organically and has benefited greatly from the resultant diverse and abundant dung beetle species that have colonized on the land. Sherry's farmed independently of family since 2001 and has formal education in wildlife ecology, veterinary science, agroecology, and animal and dairy science. She integrates this with experimentation and experience for a profitable and regenerative farm.
I'm excited to share with you guys some things that I've learned about dung beetles. They were not a group or species that I studied formally as part of my education, but just when people always ask me about how we manage our livestock without chemical dewormers, I went to looking at what works well for that, and realized that we probably had dung beetles in our manure of our livestock that was helping with parasite issues and face and cornfly issues with our livestock. So I went looking through our manure and found all kinds of beetles that I had no idea existed there. And in the process, just because I dig deeply into scientific literature, when I do investigate something, I found all kinds of information that I think you guys might be interested in. And I certainly have found fascinating, and just as a help with a connection to the land when you find out what you have on your farm or in areas around you. So I have a lot of information to share here today. So we'll go through this list as quickly as I can, but in the picture on the side here is just a few of the dung beetle species that are pretty common on our farm that I've found, and we'll go through those. So our farm is the Red Star in Wisconsin, Southwest Wisconsin, in the Wisconsin River watershed here. We have 130 acres that we do rotational grazing in that upper kind of red circle, and we have a silvopasture development in the lower blue square that's been logged now to thin the canopy to make it a silvopasture with open grown oaks in the future. We've typically had lots of different species of livestock, so pigs, chickens, goats, sheep, horses, cattle, all these animals on pasture and protected by livestock guardian dogs. We also did rotationally grazed colony rabbits too, and the dogs guarded those from predators. But our main species that we keep on the farm are the goats, sheep, and horses these days. We do a lot of outreach, and we do a pasture walk at least every year, a couple pasture walks in some years. My husband has a soils degree from UW-Madison and has a publication on energetics of soil to quantify basically how carbon is sequestered in the soil system and how it's moved around. And this lane that you see us standing in and talking with some of the pasture walk attendees was part of an EQIP, NRCS EQIP funded cost shared lane for livestock management to reduce compaction and improve water quality and soil function in our systems. So all of these things integrate together with what we do on our farm. And in studying what the benefits that these dung beetles provided besides just parasite management for our livestock, I found all kinds of stuff. So dung beetles improve soil fertility through the nutrients in the dung. They improve soil structure by reducing compaction. They improve soil biology with in coordination with earthworms and other species. Their tunnels are used by earthworms. They increase the available grazing area because animals don't eat around where they manure, where they poop. The different species of livestock will eat the grass that grows around manure, but that's called forage fouling. So they reduce forage fouling by integrating that manure into the soil. They increase pasture productivity with grass yield improvements. Water is infiltrated better via their tunneling and improvements of soil structure. They improve water quality by reducing surface runoff, reduce pests and disease, mainly those gut parasites, plus face flies and horn flies. They sequester carbon by reducing gas emissions from the manure, and they also feed wildlife. So the pictures here are bobolinks from our 30 acres of good pasture that we manage in a rotational grazing system with the horses, the goats, and the sheep. So we have lots of grassland birds that enjoy the dung beetles, plus all the other species of insects that are around. And there are other desirable dung insects. So Thelma mentioned kind of that alligator look of the larvae of the lady beetles. This is another alligator looking critter, the gold and brown rove beetle. But this is the actual beetle. This is the adult form, and this thing flies. It doesn't look like it should be able to fly, but underneath those scales are actual wings, and they are carnivorous. They eat flies and gnats that visit the dung, and they do act like an alligator. They run around and snatch insects right off the manure. The golden dung flies do the same thing. Usually it's gnats that they're after, smaller things than what the rove beetles are eating. But these golden dung flies you'll see on the manure, and this is a picture I took of a male and female mating on our horse manure here on our farm. So the dung beetles typically are classed into 3 different ecological types. There's tunnelers, dwellers, and rollers. And here in this part of the state, we don't have any rollers. We have tunnelers and dweller species. And so they all perform different things, different functions, and management for the dung beetles in a farming system or any place where there's manure that they could use will depend on what species you have there, because they all are very different. As a generalized dung beetle life cycle, this shows that they go from egg to larva to pupa, adult, they breed, they hibernate. They're always using dung, fresh dung, not dung that's been sitting there for a while. Male and female will get together and lay eggs in the manure, and the dwellers lay it in the manure pile itself. The tunnelers will bury manure below the ground and put an egg in each ball of manure. Some of them are sequentially up the burrows. They coat the burrows with manure from that dung pile. And we do have a northern roller species that is specific to, I think, elk dung, but does not use cow manure or any other domestic species manure. So mainly we're working with the dwellers and the tunnelers. These beetles all have different lengths of their life cycle. So some of them are as short as 3 weeks and some of them are as long as a year that it takes for their entire life cycle to go through. And typically the adults eat the liquid in the manure, and then their larvae, when the larvae hatch out, often are either coprophagous, they're eating the manure, or they're predatory and they're eating the larvae of other insects that are hatching out in that manure. Sometimes the adults can live up to 3 years and sometimes they don't. They die within that season. So different species, different life cycle, and different management basically from that. So when I was interested in figuring out what we had, I have not taken a formal entomology class through my wildlife ecology coursework. I didn't go through entomology. I did find a gentleman, Dr. Hayes Goosey at Montana State University, who is keenly interested in speciating the things that I found. So I made a collection of all the dung beetles that I found in our manure, put them in alcohol, which turns them black like you see here. And I put out this slide because it shows you kind of the different sizes of the different species that we found with a typical lab slide, a microscope slide for reference for size there. But Dr. Goosey speciated everything for me. And it wasn't until later that I realized that we do have Dr. Nadine Kriska here in Wisconsin at UW Whitewater that does dung beetle speciation too. So in future, people can go to her for speciation for what they find. So our dwellers in color, these are pictures in color of the things that we had, are mostly dwellers. Like I said, there's the Aphodius group. So Aphodius granarius, lividus, pimentarius, and then also dwellers that aren't true dung beetles, but are hydrophilid beetles or water beetles that are specific to dung, are these two here that are, the one has what I consider like a gold butt and red spots on its side. They're very fast moving and different from the other dweller species that are slow moving. The tunneler species that I found on our farm, Onthophagus hecate, is a much bigger beetle than all the rest of these. Slow moving, it freezes when you grab it or touch it, pulls its legs in and acts like it's a rock or something, probably an evasion from predator. But anyway, they're the ones that probably do the most for our soils in terms of burying manure. These other species do more for breaking down the manure pats and eating the face fly larvae, the gastrointestinal larvae, the horn fly larvae, things like that, and drying out the manure pats to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Hysteridae is the one that's in the middle of the picture, and then the hydrophilid beetle that is the most common, the red butt, red sides and golden butt is to the upper right. These beetles also carry mites, which is really interesting. The mites inoculate the manure with telluric fungi, which helps the manure break down too. So not only are the beetles beneficial, but the mites they're carrying are beneficial to our manure incorporation back into the soil system. So there are other species of dung beetles in Wisconsin, and I did my some PhD research at the beef grazing station at Arlington, UW-Madison Arlington beef grazing station. And our farm is only 53 miles away from Arlington, but we only have an overlap of 3 beetle species. So we found 11 beetle species at our farm, dung beetles, and 8 at Arlington, and only 3 overlap. It's quite surprising how such a small distance away in the same state can produce such a different collection of species of these dung beetles. And they can fly 30 miles to get to new manure. So as long as there's organic sources of manure around, you would think that these other species would find their way to Arlington, or those Arlington species that we don't have would find their way to us. But I haven't found any of these other species besides those with the red stars by them on our farm. So the tunneler activity is really interesting. It's called bioturbation. And different species of dung beetles will bury their manure different depths in the soil. So ours are basically medium tunnelers, but the large tunnelers and rollers really take the manure far from the manure pad itself and bury it. They're even better, but we just don't have many of those here in Wisconsin. So I like to see that bioturbation because it means that manure is getting buried, and nutrients and all the benefits of dung beetles are happening on our farm. The other thing that's really interesting about this is in a prairie system where fire is a predominant management tool, presumably there would be, and there is, after you've run a fire across an area, you have biochar, you have black material left on the surface, and livestock grazing following a fire would be picking up that biochar. Then the dung beetles would be burying that biochar into the soil profile, basically inoculating deep levels of the soil with recalcitrant carbon and increasing soil cation exchange capacity, plus increasing carbon sequestration. So these are things that we can take advantage of, especially in sandy soils, which don't have a high cation exchange capacity to begin with. We can help with water holding and soil structure and exchange by including charcoal in the diets of the livestock that then get buried by the dung beetles. Rotational grazing has been really beneficial for dung beetles, especially on our farm and in places where dwellers are the primary community of dung beetles, because it gives a rest and it doesn't disturb that manure while the dung beetles are completing their life cycle. So also with rotational grazing, all the animals are in a small paddock for a short period of time. Their manure is concentrated in that small area. So dung beetles looking for mates can find each other. And then the animals are moved to the next section of the rotational system before the manure is trampled. And it's within minutes of the manure dropping that the dung beetles find these fresh manure paths and start working on putting their eggs in them. So typically in a rotational system, you have 20 to 40 days of rest before the animals are brought back to that particular section of the pasture. And our Avoidance species, based on what Dr. Kriska had said, is that they would have a life cycle every 3 to 4 weeks, or 4 to 6 generations per summer. That falls right within the 28 days of rest that paddock would get. So those species are going to be able to produce more offspring and increase the population of dung beetles with a rotational system. The Onthophagus hecate typically has 2 generations per summer, so it would need a 60-day rotation rest period between grazing events for if it was dwelling within that manure. But since it's a tunneler, it buries its eggs below the surface, so you don't need to rest the paddock that long. Those dung beetles will emerge, and the livestock coming back through aren't going to damage the tunnels that those dung beetles have made. So different species, different management, but really good benefits. And we do organic management even of our horses. This is horse manure in this picture with small strongyls that one of the horses clearly had some small strongyls, went out and ate some chicory or plantain or bird's foot trefoil, or ate a little bit of extra copper from our mineral buffet that we use for providing their minerals, and dewormed herself. And so all these worms came out in the manure, and I saw that and took a picture of it. The red ones are red because they have blood in their GI system, and they were just recently attached to the intestines. The white ones weren't attached, so there's a little white one off to the side there. This is what you would expect to see after giving a chemical dewormer to a horse or any other livestock, would be these to come out. But we don't deworm our horses with chemicals, and we don't intentionally give them anything else to deworm them. So this is just all from natural deworming within our pasture system. So there are groups of dewormers that are more problematic than others. The ivermectin class, the macrocyclic lactones are the group of dewormers that are most detrimental to these dung beetle species. And the dung beetle adults aren't able to avoid the manure pats that are from animals that have been treated with ivermectin. They don't have the ability to detect that in a way, but it kills their larvae when they hatch out. So they will put their eggs in chemically treated manure basically, and they will die. But they're equal opportunity. So if you have to deworm some animals in a management system, deworming just the ones that are absolutely needing the deworming and leaving the rest of them to have unchemically treated manure still supports dung beetles. And the ones that lay their eggs in the chemically treated manure will die. The ones that use the untreated manure will survive and reproduce. So basically avoid the chemical dewormers as much as possible. There are some that are more beetle friendly, like moxidectin, and those can be used. But again, we don't find it necessary because there are organic anthelmintics or dewormers that exist in our environment, and every place will have plants that contain these secondary metabolites that are anthelmintic. So tannins, the adenine ascorbic acid, saponins, terpenoids, caffeic acid. These are all plant secondary metabolites that have actual activity, verified activity against helminths. And helminths are those roundworm parasites that are affecting most of our livestock species and what people use for, that's why people would chemically deworm, is to get rid of those helminths. So we don't need to do that when we have these plants that just grow in our pastures and in our woodlands and that sort of thing, and the animals will eat them as needed to manage their own parasite levels. So some examples of tannin-containing plants are chicory, plantain, birdsfoot, trefoil, walnut, locust, oak, raspberry, poison ivy, wormwood, aronia. These are all things that grow here and are part of our pasture system, and our animals eat them as they need them. Terpenoids are pine, bedstraw, cedar, ginkgo, hemp, caffeic acid. People used to deworm livestock. They used to grow tobacco to deworm their livestock. You don't see so much of that these days, but wintergreen, and we have lots of heal-all around our farm and in our pastures. Saponins are found in alfalfa, plantain, sunflower, yam, asparagus, garlic, tomatoes. We have lots of solanaceous plant species in our pastures that people consider weeds and sometimes toxic, but the animals don't eat so much of them to toxify themselves. They just use them for benefits that those secondary metabolites have. When the manure is treated with ivermectin, the breakdown period is much slower than if the manure is not treated with ivermectin. And it gets treated by the animal being treated for deworming with that chemical, either topically or orally. It all ends up in the manure, coming out in the manure. And this study didn't feed the animals that, but they used a drenching of the manure itself for studying how long it took for the manure pats to break down with dung beetles, whether they were treated or not treated with ivermectin. And so it's definitely good to avoid the treatments if you can. So forage fouling is avoidance of grazing around manure pats. And this picture shows what is typical in a overgrazed system where the manure pats are denoted by grass that's taller growing out of it. And it's not just a nutrient deficiency issue. If it was deficient, those taller bundles of grass would be darker green than the surrounding area. But since it's an even green, we know that the fertility is even across this site, but the animals are avoiding eating the grass that's growing directly out of those manure pats. And so without dung beetles in the system, the area of avoidance would be 5 times larger than when you have dung beetles in the system. And so these beetles are breaking down the manure, allowing the livestock to consume more of the forage, producing a source of fertility for those grasses. And so the grasses actually grow more than in places where the dung beetles aren't active. And here's an example of the soil cations or fertility getting into the soil. And this study, they looked at sandy loams with dung beetles, without dung beetles, and with 2 species of ontophagus. So like that one that we have that berries, that is a tunneler species, is most similar to these species. And so you can see that the phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and the sum of the cations with the dung beetles in the system is higher than without it, and certainly without dung. Water percolation also improves with dung beetles. So this study showed that the D plus B is dung plus the beetles, D is dung alone, and the X is the control. Those tall gray bars, dark gray, were significantly different than the other treatments where beetles were not a part of the system. And then pasture productivity, so the yield of pasture, you can support more animals or you can support more birds and beetles and bugs on a pasture that has greater productivity. We definitely see more tons of biomass produced per acre in places where dung beetles and dung are actively working. So in a place where dung is there but treated with chemicals, we just don't see much difference than the controls. And in systems where there isn't grazing and there isn't dung being deposited, none of these benefits would accrue. So it's valuable to have livestock in a forage-based system for these benefits. And then also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The manure pats are dried out by the activity of the dung beetles. The tunneling, the manure-eating dung beetles will actually drink the liquid parts of the manure and dry out the pat. And then their larvae hatch, and there are some species that continue to basically drink and consume that liquid part of the manure, and then other species prey on other larvae of other insects within the pad. So all that activity dries the pad out, which reduces greenhouse gas emitting from these surface applied manures from the animal. It doesn't work for dairy manure or something spread out of a lagoon. The dung beetles aren't attracted to that. Some of the challenges with raising or with attracting dung beetles to the land is getting a diversity and supporting an effective population. I think a lot of what we see with like the rolling species of dung beetles that you more commonly see in the southern states where they have a longer growing season, warmer overall temperature, those manure pads disappear within hours or days. We don't see that as much up here. There's a lot of dung beetle activity, but they don't make the manure disappear the way the bigger species and the more populated areas are for dung beetles. And we've intentionally managed to have more dung beetles, but it doesn't seem like we can do more than what we're doing right now. And we still don't get the fast removal of manure like we see in the South or in Australia, which is where a lot of this research has been done. Half of our year is frozen, too cold. We don't have rollers. Most of our species are dwellers. Even with the different life strategies, we can manage for that. And also many producers still rely on chemical dewormers for management of their livestock. And so the number of farms that are organic around us might be limiting the number of species that could get to us. We do have, in Southwest Wisconsin, there are quite a few organic producers, which is nice. So I'm sure we're all sharing dung beetle populations, and that's helping. But there's plenty that aren't.
Sherry, we're a little bit over, so just to put that on your radar.
Yep, so here's the summary of the things that they do really well. And if you have any questions, you can find me at the phone number there or my email. And I'm also on Facebook. And so I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Thank you, Sherry. That was incredible.